Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we are going to dive into a genuinely fascinating framework that completely flips how we look at the world right on its head. It reveals how the rules, the physical limits, and the societal structures all around us aren't just, boxing us in. They are actually the active building blocks of our future possibilities. It's a brilliant concept from independent researcher John Canelo, and it completely reframes how we understand change over time.
So, let's kick things off by challenging a pretty universal assumption. When you hear the word constraint, what's the first thing that pops into your head? A speed limit? A locked door? Maybe a really strict rule? We tend to just assume that rules, boundaries, and limits only serve one purpose: to hold us back and restrict our freedom. We think of them as these immovable barriers that just shrink down what we can do. But what if that restrictive nature is actually the secret engine of progress?
All right, part one, rethinking our view of constraints. Let's get right into it.
To really get a handle on how change happens, we first need a bit of a mind shift to rethink what a constraint actually does. Let's look at this with a perfectly everyday example. Think about a temporary car park for a second. The painted lines and those bright orange traffic cones act as a limiting constraint, right? They restrict where you can drive so you don't just plow straight across the lot. But simultaneously, those exact same restrictions enable a highly coordinated system. By limiting your freedom to just drive literally anywhere, the constraints create functional lanes, safe parking spaces, and totally predictable pedestrian routes. The limitation doesn't just stop activity, it actually enables a stable, coherent pattern of activity that would be absolute chaos without it.
And that right there brings us to the absolute core thesis of this paper. The author proposes that constraints actually move through a powerful three-step progression. First, limitation. That's restricting trajectories, exactly like we just discussed. Second, enablement. That's where those restrictions actually coordinate and stabilize our activity. But it's the third step that changes the whole game: construction. This is where a constraint doesn't just manage the present, it literally builds the conditions for the future. Moving right along to part two, from enabler to constructor. Now, it's pretty easy to see how a constraint acts as an enabler, right? But the real magic, the profound leap, happens when we flip it into a totally new dimension: the constructor. Now, we need to clarify what we mean by construction here, because it doesn't mean magical creation out of thin air. It's not like an architect sitting down with a blueprint. Actually, scratch that. It's more like laying down the tracks while the train is already moving. In this framework, construction refers to the physical or institutional establishment of relations that dictate what pathways will even be accessible to us tomorrow. It means the actions we take within our current limits actually modify those very limits, carving out new pathways for whatever comes next.
Which brings us to part three, the core mechanism of RCR.
So we are talking about a highly abstract but honestly brilliant academic framework at the center of the paper, known as Recursive Constraint Reorganization, or thankfully RCR for short. It's this beautiful, continuous flow. It starts with an existing constraint organization, the rules currently in place. Those constraints shape our present activity, but then that activity pushes back. It modifies those very constraints. And finally, those newly altered constraints recursively shape future activity. It's a historical ordering. The present is shaped by the past, sure, but the present modifies the boundaries that will shape the future. Now hold on, we have to be a little careful here. RCR isn't some magical upward escalator of progress, and it definitely isn't a conscious thinking entity. The system isn't, trying to improve itself like some hyper-intelligent sci-fi computer. It simply describes the historical ordering of how limits reconstruct themselves over time. RCR simply occurs. It is neither inherently good nor inherently bad. It's just the mechanical reality of how organized systems evolve over time. All right, part four, 6 possible conditional outcomes. Because RCR isn't intrinsically good, and it doesn't have some purposeful end goal in mind, tweaking these constraints can lead to wildly different realities. The sheer complexity of these outcomes is pretty staggering. Once a constraint is modified locally, the system doesn't just stop. It is continuously evaluated against 2 key things: viability and persistence. Essentially, can the system survive under these new rules, and do these new rules stick around long enough to even matter? Depending on those answers, the system branches off into entirely different futures, which we can basically categorize into 6 possible outcomes. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that, on the positive side, RCR can lead to beautiful cumulative development, where viable modifications progressively reconstruct a system into something way more advanced, or even emergence, where an entirely distinct, coherent regime just arises.
But it can just as easily go the other way. It can construct rigidity, pathology, and complete failure, where modifications actively undermine the system's ability to even continue. Changing a constraint doesn't guarantee a better future at all. It just guarantees a different landscape of possibilities. Let's make this concrete. Part 5, RCR in the real world. To show you just how universal this domain-neutral theory really is, let's rapid-fire through 3 completely different domains to see RCR in action. First up, biology, specifically morphogenesis, which is how organisms actually grow their shape. In biological development, a newly formed tissue boundary doesn't just lock cells in place, it acts as a constructor. It builds the literal walls, the mechanical forces, and the signaling dependencies that the entire future organism will absolutely rely on to grow further. The cell's earlier activity constructed the exact boundaries that dictate their future development.
Okay, next, let's zoom in on human cognition right inside our own brains. When you sit down to learn a specific skill, say playing the piano or grasping a really complex math concept, you actually lose random flexibility. You constrain your actions. But in doing so, you construct a highly reliable sensory motor organization in your brain. This new constraint framework allows you to tackle previously impossible, higher-level tasks. Your past learning literally reconstructed the conditions for your future thinking.
And finally, let's zoom out to society and technology. Think about the invention of the USB port, or even electrical outlets. Setting a strict technological standard severely restricts alternative designs. You can't just build a plug however you want anymore. But it constructs vital infrastructure, global supply chains, and user expectations. Even if, let's be real, it always takes us 3 tries to plug a USB in correctly, it creates this rigid environment that all future engineers and innovators absolutely must navigate.
As the paper's author points out, the future, it is not just some blank void of infinite free-floating choices. The possibilities available to us tomorrow are specifically carved out, limited, and organized by the restrictive structures we lay down today. We don't just step into the future. We build its walls and its corridors through the constraints we navigate right now.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. Look around at the rules, the routines, the habits, and the limitations in your own world right now. It is so easy to see them just as things holding you back, but through the lens of recursive constraint reorganization, ask yourself, how are those very constraints not just limiting you, but actively, recursively constructing the exact rooms you will walk into tomorrow? Thanks for joining me for this one, and I seriously challenge you to look at the boundaries in your life just a little bit differently today.